The call from the Swiss embassy came while I was in the middle of teaching my morning economics class. My phone, always on silent during lectures, lit up with a number that made my blood run cold. Plus 4131. The Swiss Federal Department of Foreign Affairs. Professor Hartmann, please continue with Chapter 7. I told my teaching assistant, stepping into the hallway with as much composure as I could manage. Mr. Andreas Kellner? The voice was crisp, speaking German-accented English. Yes. This is Deputy Ambassador Wilhelm Brenner from the Swiss Embassy in Washington. We have a situation regarding your diplomatic collection. Several pieces have appeared at a pawn shop in Arlington, Virginia. My stomach dropped. That's impossible. They're in my safe at home. Sir, these watches are flagged in our international database. When someone attempted to verify their authenticity for sale, our systems were immediately alerted. These are not just watches, Mr. Kellner. They are diplomatic property of the Swiss Confederation. I ended the call with promises to meet him within the hour and drove home with my hands shaking on the wheel. The safe in my study was open, the door swinging mockingly. Empty. All 12 watches gone. On the kitchen counter was a note in my stepson Tyler's handwriting. Borrowed some of your old watches to help with rent. We'll pay you back. T&M. T&M, Tyler and Madison. My wife Linda's 20-something children who had moved back home 6 months ago, both claiming financial hardship. The same children who called me Andy instead of Dad and reminded me constantly that I was just Mom's husband. I called Linda immediately. She answered on the third ring, her voice bright from her business trip in Chicago. Hi, honey. How's everything at home? Linda, your children stole my watch collection. Silence. Then, oh, Andy, I'm sure stole is a strong word. Maybe they borrowed. They pawned them. All 12 watches. The ones from my father. She sighed, that particular sigh that meant she was about to defend them again. Look, I know you're attached to those old watches, but Tyler's been struggling with rent, and Madison has those student loans. If they borrowed them. Linda, stop. Just stop. Those aren't just watches. I need you to understand something I've never told you. Never told anyone in America. What are you talking about? I have to meet someone from the Swiss Embassy in 30 minutes. When I get back, we need to talk. I hung up and drove to the pawn shop listed on the receipt I'd found crumpled in Tyler's trash can. Arlington Gold and Pawn sat between a liquor store and a check-cashing place, the kind of establishment that profited from desperation. The Swiss Embassy's black sedan was already there. Deputy Ambassador Brenner stood outside, tall, silver-haired, wearing a suit that probably cost more than most people's cars. With him were 2 men who were clearly security. Mr. Kellner, Brenner nodded. Or should I say, Counselor Kellner? I winced. That was a long time ago, Deputy Ambassador. Not so long that we've forgotten your service. Shall we? Inside the pawn shop, the owner, a nervous-looking man named Gary, was already pulling watches from his display case with shaking hands. I had no idea, he kept saying. The kids said they were their grandfather's old watches. I gave them $3,000 for the lot. $3,000. If I'd known what they were worth. Brenner examined each watch carefully, checking serial numbers against his tablet. The Patek Philippe given to you by the Shah of Iran, 1978. The Vacheron Constantine from the Camp David Accords. The Audemars Piguet from the Geneva Convention. He looked up at me. These aren't just watches, Mr. Kellner. These are historical artifacts. Gary had gone pale. How? How much are they worth? The Patek alone was recently valued at $1.2 million, Brenner said calmly. The complete collection? Approximately $6 million. Gary fainted. While his assistant revived him with smelling salts, I stood there staring at the watches that represented my former life. Each one had been a gift, presented during diplomatic negotiations I'd facilitated as a young Swiss Foreign Service officer. I'd been a translator initially, gifted with languages, speaking 7 fluently by age 25. But I'd become something more, a negotiator, a keeper of secrets, a bridge between nations. The watches had been gifts of appreciation. In diplomatic circles, such gifts were traditional, expected. They were never meant to be sold. They were diplomatic property, held in trust. When I'd left the service to marry my first wife and moved to America, I'd been allowed to keep them with the understanding that they remained under Swiss diplomatic protection. Your stepchildren have committed a serious crime, Brenner said quietly. Theft of diplomatic property is a federal offense. The State Department will need to be involved. They didn't know, I said weakly. Ignorance is not a defense. However, he paused, studying me. You've been living quietly as a professor for 15 years. No one wants this to become an international incident. If the watches are returned and certain conditions are met, perhaps this can be resolved discreetly. My phone buzzed. Linda, Tyler says you're overreacting about some old watches. He says they were ugly anyway and you never wore them. Ugly old watches. That's what my stepchildren had always called them. They'd mocked my obsession with keeping them in a climate-controlled safe. Why not just buy a Rolex from this century? Madison had laughed just last week. Because a Rolex from this century didn't prevent a war, I'd wanted to say. Because a modern watch didn't sit on my wrist while I translated for world leaders deciding the fate of millions. I need to make a call, I told Brenner. I stepped outside and called Tyler. He answered with his usual casual indifference. Hey, Andy. Got your note. Look, I'll pay you back when I can. Tyler, listen very carefully. You have stolen property belonging to the Swiss government. The embassy is here. Federal agents are being called. You and Madison need to come to Arlington Gold and pawn immediately. What? Come on, they're just watches. Tyler, shut up and listen. Each watch is worth between $500,000 and $1.2 million. You've committed grand theft and violated international diplomatic protocols. If you're not here in 20 minutes, you'll be arrested at work. Silence. Then, you're joking. Google Patek Philippe Shah of Iran 1978. Then get here. I hung up and went back inside. Gary was now conscious, sitting in a chair, staring at the watches like they might explode. $6 million, he kept muttering. I had $6 million in my shop. Brenner was on his phone, speaking rapid French. He ended the call and turned to me. The State Department wants to keep this quiet. If your stepchildren cooperate, we can avoid prosecution. But there are conditions. What kind of conditions? Before he could answer, Tyler and Madison burst through the door. Tyler in his barista apron, Madison in her retail uniform. They stopped short when they saw the officials. What's going on? Madison demanded. Andy, what did you do? What did I do? I laughed bitterly. I spent 20 years preventing international incidents, and you two created one in an afternoon. Brenner stepped forward. You are Tyler and Madison Harris? They nodded mutely. You have stolen and attempted to sell property belonging to the Swiss Confederation. These watches are not personal property. They are diplomatic gifts held in trust by Mr. Kellner from his years of service. Service? Tyler looked at me. You were a translator. I was considerably more than that, I said quietly. Brenner pulled out his tablet, showing them a photograph. It was me, 30 years younger, standing between President Reagan and Soviet leader Gorbachev at the Reykjavik summit. Your stepfather, Brenner said, was one of the most important diplomatic negotiators of the Cold War. He spoke for Switzerland in 7 different peace accords. The watches you stole were gifts from heads of state, each one commemorating successful negotiations that prevented conflicts. Madison had gone pale. But he's just a community college professor. By choice, I said. After my first wife died, I wanted a quiet life. A normal life. I thought I could have that here. Why didn't you ever tell us? Tyler asked. Would it have mattered? You've made it clear from day one that I'm not your real father. Just the guy who married your mom. Linda arrived then, having driven from the airport. She looked at the scene, the officials, the watches, her children's terrified faces, and immediately went into defense mode. Whatever's happening here, I'm sure it's a misunderstanding. Mrs. Kellner, Brenner interrupted. Your children have committed a federal crime. However, given your husband's service record and our desire to avoid publicity, we're prepared to offer an alternative to prosecution. What alternative? Linda asked. Community service. Specifically, Tyler and Madison will spend the next 2 years working with Swiss refugee resettlement programs. They'll learn what diplomatic service actually means. In exchange, no charges will be filed. 2 years. Madison protested. I have a life here. You have a retail job and live with your parents, Brenner said coldly. This is an opportunity to do something meaningful. Or you can face federal charges for theft of property worth $6 million. Your choice. Tyler looked at me. For the first time since I'd married his mother, he actually looked at me. $6 million? Really? The Shah's watch alone is worth 1.2, I said. It was given to me after I helped negotiate the release of Swiss nationals during the Iranian Revolution. I was 26. Not much older than you are now. Why didn't you ever sell them? If they're worth so much. Because they're not mine to sell. They belong to history. To the moments when words prevented wars. You can't just pawn history because you're behind on rent. Linda had been silent, staring at the watches. Andreas, I don't understand. You told me you were a translator who immigrated here. A simple man with a teaching degree. I was a translator. That part was true. But I was also senior diplomatic counselor for the Swiss Foreign Service. I held the rank of ambassador. I gave it all up when Maria got sick. Came to America for her treatment. After she died, I just stayed. Became someone else. Someone ordinary. But you kept the watches, Linda said. They were all I kept. Reminders that once I did something that mattered. Brenner cleared his throat. Mr. and Ms. Harris, what is your decision? Service or prosecution? Tyler and Madison exchanged glances. Service, Tyler said quietly. We'll do the service. Good. Report to the embassy tomorrow morning, 8 a.m. sharp. Bring your passports. Brenner turned to me. Counselor Kellner, the watches will need to be properly secured. The embassy can provide appropriate storage. No, I said, surprising everyone. I think it's time they went home. Donate them to the Swiss National Museum. Let them be displayed properly with their stories told. Brenner nodded approvingly. A fitting end. I'll make the arrangements. As the officials prepared to leave with the watches, Tyler approached me hesitantly. Andy. Mr. Kellner. Andreas is fine, I said. Andreas, I'm sorry. We thought they were just old watches. Ugly old watches you never wore. They were never meant to be worn, Tyler. They were meant to be remembered. Madison joined us. Will you tell us about them? The real stories. For the first time in 5 years, I saw something other than dismissive contempt in my stepchildren's faces. I saw curiosity. Maybe even respect. Tomorrow, I said. After you register at the embassy. I'll tell you about each one. That night, Linda found me in my empty study, looking at the vacant safe. 15 years, she said. We've been married 5 years, together for 7. And I never knew who you really were. You knew who I am, I corrected. You just didn't know who I was. Why didn't you tell me? Because I wanted to be just Andy. Your husband. A professor. Normal. But you're not normal. She gestured helplessly. You're someone who prevented wars. I was. Now I teach economics and try to be a stepfather to kids who just learned I exist. She was quiet for a long moment. They'll learn a lot in those 2 years. Hopefully they'll learn that some things are worth more than money. That service means something. That history isn't just ugly old watches in a safe. And maybe, Linda said softly, they'll learn who their stepfather really is. 6 months later, Tyler sent me a photo from a refugee camp in Jordan where he was teaching English to Syrian children. Understanding why the watches mattered now, his message read. These kids have nothing but the stories they carry. Just like the watches carried yours. Madison wrote from Greece, where she was helping process asylum applications. Met a diplomat today who knew you. He said you once spent 72 straight hours negotiating to prevent a border war. He said you saved thousands of lives with words. I told him you were my father. First time I've ever said that. The watches now sit in a climate-controlled display at the Swiss National Museum in Zurich. Each one has a small placard telling its story. The Patek Philippe from the Shah. The Vacheron Constantin from Camp David. The Audemars Piguet from Geneva. But the real story, the one about a man who gave up everything to be ordinary, whose stepchildren discovered he was extraordinary only after they tried to pawn his past. That story isn't on any placard. That story lives where all the best diplomatic stories live. In the spaces between words, in the actions taken to prevent rather than provoke, in the quiet recognition that sometimes the most valuable things look like ugly old watches until you understand what they've witnessed. And sometimes it takes almost losing everything to realize